In order to better understand how our neighborhood was made, let's start with a look at the land. The Great Sioux Wars lasted from 1854 to 1891, ending with the Wounded Knee Massacre on the Great Plains. The rapid colonization of the lands west of the Mississippi River was well established by the 1890s. Native nations had largely been forcibly removed and sequestered on their reserved lands, seen here on this map in orange. They were in the process of undergoing a civilizing campaign similar to the programs which were targeting the recent European immigrants in the dirty, crowded, industrialized cities. Ceded lands, shown in yellow on the map, were seen as a canvas upon which an American civilization could be designed. For context, Washington achieved statehood in 1889, and the Spokane Reservation was set aside in 1881. The City Beautiful movement arose during what is known as the Progressive Era in U.S. history. This era ran from approximately 1890 into the 1920s and was marked by widespread social upheaval, frequent martial law, the unionization of labor, political corruption, and subsequently major social reform efforts. From the Civil War to 1910, the U.S. population tripled. It went from 31.4 million to 91.9 million people. Most of these folks had immigrated from all around the world in order to seek opportunity here in America. But it was a grave disappointment when an economic depression hit from 1893 to 1897, which only made matters worse for those living in tenements such as these with overcrowding and poverty. The impoverished ethnic workers were living in squalor in housing conditions much like this in many areas across the country. Social and labor reformers mobilized in order to do their best to solve some of these wicked problems. Issues that they were faced with included an unfettered exploitation of child labor, low wages for women's labor. Women weren't citizens, and they lacked the right to vote. And there were men's labor issues. In fact, today's May 4th, 2015. It marks the 129th anniversary of the Haymarket riots in Chicago. Social unrest also touched lives here in Spokane. The Spokane area was regionally and economically tied to the mining industries in nearby Idaho. When mine owners sought to increase the profitability of their mining enterprises, they lowered their miners' wages and raised their cost of living. These measures brought major mining strikes in the Idaho Coeur d'Alene mining district in 1892 and then again in 1899. There were time periods of short-lived riots followed by longer periods of martial law. Concern with the physical conditions of living and working spaces of these immigrant communities by early social activists and reformers led them to start to record data so that government action could be taken to better the living and working conditions of these people. This is an example of a wage map that where data was collected out in the field in the tenements, representing total earnings per week of a family. Daniel Burnham led the way with his colleagues to develop the City Beautiful movement, which focused heavily on architecture. Burnham believed that his work in designing the layout of land for human settlement complemented the progressive reform movement. Reform ideas were synergized with philosophies of Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, and Alexander von Humboldt. The two most notable frameworks discussed are often environmental determinism and social Darwinism, but there were many more. Burnham, businessmen, industrialists, and Christian philanthropists adopted features of these philosophies in their daily decision-making. The philosophy behind the City Beautiful movement assumed a cosmic purpose to nature and that all phenomena could be explained by physical laws. Decision makers believed that they could mimic mathematical harmonies in nature in the physical form of city design and that this would affect a transformation in human consciousness. One of the major downfalls of this thinking at the time was that there was still an assumption of elite superiority among certain classes and races of people. This is why we see that the best principles of City Beautiful were often reserved for public spaces and elite neighborhoods. This was also one of the major criticisms of the movement. So what were the elements of City Beautiful? Let's look. There's a core belief that the design of the built environment impacts human thought and behavior, that a change in the physical environment will result in a change in moral and social composure of citizens. The built environment is seen as a means of social control that sets the stage for the urban drama, and where a vision of social harmony can be metaphorically sculpted. So beautification through the built and natural environment, monumental grandeur and architectural focus, sightlines to natural and man-made monuments, and classical buildings typically painted white. Let's take a look at a few examples of public spaces that were designed using City Beautiful elements. This here is Chicago's waterfront. Notice how large the buildings are. In this instance, they're painted white. They have lots of architectural detail. You notice that they have columns. There's lots of statuary placed throughout the plaza area, and a lot of other types of monuments. And then the people look very small in comparison to the buildings. And this example is Portland Park, with many of the same features as mentioned before, except this one has more use of the greenery and the natural environment to set off different areas for different uses, and has more of a focus on directing foot traffic through the pathways. So now that we've seen a little bit of the context of what City Beautiful looks like, let's see if we can find these elements and how they've been applied in the Browne's addition in Spokane. In the spring of 1878, John J. Browne began to develop the prime residential area that became known as Browne's Addition. When it was platted in the early 1880s, the east-west streets continued the downtown grid of Spokane Falls. North-south streets were named after indigenous trees. Streets connect spaces and places, composing the horizontal forms of a neighborhood. We look at street patterns, size, scale, and relationships between streets and their buildings. Some streets line up to natural or man-made monuments, but some of these features no longer exist or are obscured by now mature trees or new buildings that have come into place since the original design was implemented. This is First Avenue looking towards downtown Spokane, Washington, from within Browne's Addition. Can you guess what's behind me? It's the Finch House. Can you see the resemblance to the photos of Chicago's waterfront? This is the view looking towards downtown from the front porch of the Finch House. Notice that the avenue is lined with sycamore trees and that the branches form an arboreal arch over the street. Browne's Addition was originally designed for public transit and walkability. The streets were narrow and were built around a horse-drawn trolley system, which was later electrified. As seen here in this picture, we still have some streets with the original brick pavers. Times may have changed and the form of transit may be different, but the design is still in use. Here we show people waiting for the bus at the bus stop on the corner by the Coeur d'Alene Park, and in the background ahead of us we see a father with his son and his bicycle walking down the street. The mature tree canopy and park-like atmosphere that was created by the design creates an inviting area for people to walk and recreate and increases social interaction. In fact, people who live within the community often use the space, but also people who work downtown or in nearby neighborhoods come here to walk or run or exercise their pets. And then there are people riding their bikes for faster and longer range mobility. All of these uses of the original design actually increase the opportunities for social interaction. Now let's take a look at the buildings within Browne's Addition and look for some of the elements of City Beautiful. Buildings form the vertical street walls that shape and articulate the public realm. This creates a sense of place. Because City Beautiful focused particularly on architecture, the design of the public and private buildings was emphasized as a tool to elevate humanity to higher states of harmony, moral, and civil virtue. This is the most recognizable element of City Beautiful in the Browne's Addition neighborhood. This is the Finch House, which was built in classical revival style in 1898, designed by architects Cutter and Malgrim for John A. Finch, who was a Spokane mining investment partner to Amasa Campbell. This is an example of colonial revival architecture. It's the Robbins House, built in 1899 and designed by architect Albert Held for Charles P. Robbins, who was a mining investor. This colonial revival example is the Graves White House. It was built in 1899, designed by architects Cutter and Malgram for J. P. Graves, a mining investor. This is an example of craftsman architecture. It's the Reed House, built in 1899, designed by architect Albert Held. This is an example of East Lake Cottage architecture. It's the Klinked House, built in 1886. This is an example of eclectic architecture, built in 1898, designed by architects Cutter and Malgram for mining investor Patrick "Patsy" Clark. This is an example of Mediterranean architecture. It's the Wheel House, built in 1906, designed by architect Albert Held. This is an example of Mission Revival architecture. It's called the Wakefield House, built in 1898, designed by architects Cutter and Malgram for William J.C. Wakefield, attorney for Amasa Campbell and John Finch. This is an example of Queen Anne style architecture. It's the Robertson's House. It was built in 1900 for labor law attorney F. Conrad Robertson, who helped end martial law in the Coeur d'Alene mining district. Another example of Queen Anne style architecture, this is the Argyle Sauce House. It was built in 1900 for John Argyle, a mining investor. This is an example of Tudor Revival architecture. This is the Campbell House. It was built in 1898, designed by architect Kirtland Cutter for Amasa Campbell, a bold mining venturer. This is another example of Tudor Revival architecture. This is the Russell House, which was built in 1900 for Wakefield Russell, a banker and mining investor. Public spaces within a neighborhood can be conceptualized as the formal and informal living rooms of the city. The parks, the sidewalks, the areas along the right-of-way, or patios along the street at local restaurants are all part of the public interface or the public realm. They are gathering places that can be thought of as setting the stage for or creating a backdrop to the urban drama. They can also be a form of social control. Some areas are concealed for privacy, while others invite conversation and interaction between spaces. Some spaces have an open interface with explicitly public space, while others define their boundaries more clearly, like this gated garden, excluding and controlling the interaction with the public space. Are there elements of City Beautiful within the landscapes in Browne's edition? Let's take a look. Landscapes bring order, a park-like atmosphere, rhythm in the placement of shrubs and trees, and in this case, the mature tree canopy casts dappled shade along the strolling areas, the sidewalks, and the streets. Landscape is the living adornment of urban greenery found in parks and the public right-of-way. It includes elements like trees, shrubbery, flowers, and grasses. It's a theatrical property used to guide the character and beauty of a city and furnishes the stage with trees and bushes, carpeting the city with grass and flowers. Here you see the landscape mingles the private yard, the public sidewalk, and wide right-of-ways with mature street trees shading the walkway as the pedestrians make their way towards the park. This is the front yard of the Westminster Apartments, a historical apartment building with over 70 units. Its front yard is semi-public with a fairly formal front yard seating area that's sectioned off from the public realm by low shrubs that control the traffic and the interaction, but still invite some discourse and interaction from the sidewalk and the streets. Well, neighbors, I think we could definitely see the elements of City Beautiful in the Browne's edition neighborhood.